Have you ever watched someone turn their deepest wounds into a badge of honor, wearing their emotional scars like medals of distinction? This fascinating psychological phenomenon reveals exactly how avoidants reframe pain into superiority, transforming their most vulnerable moments into evidence of their strength and independence. When people with avoidant attachment styles experience emotional hurt, they don't simply feel it and move on. Instead, they perform a remarkable mental gymnastics routine that would make Olympic athletes jealous. They take that raw, stinging pain and somehow spin it into proof that they're better off alone, smarter than everyone else, and far too sophisticated for such messy human emotions. This psychological sleight of hand isn't just interesting to observe from the outside. Understanding this process matters deeply because it affects millions of relationships, workplace dynamics, and family connections every single day. When someone consistently transforms their pain into superiority, they create an invisible wall between themselves and the world. They might appear confident and self-reliant, but underneath lies a complex web of protective mechanisms that keep genuine connection at arm's length. The avoidant mind works like a master magician, making vulnerability disappear and replacing it with an illusion of strength. But here's what makes this particularly intriguing. This transformation happens so smoothly and automatically that even the person doing it might not realize they're performing this mental magic trick. They genuinely believe they've moved beyond needing others, that they've evolved past the messy complications of emotional dependence. Think about Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl, who often masked her pain from abandonment and betrayal by projecting an image of glamorous independence. She would turn her hurt into a kind of superiority, acting as though she was above the drama even while being deeply affected by it. This pattern reveals something profound about how the human mind protects itself from acknowledging its own needs and vulnerabilities. But what happens when this protective strategy becomes so automatic that it starts controlling someone's entire approach to relationships and life? If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now, picture a successful architect named Marcus, who prided himself on creating beautiful spaces where people could connect and build memories together. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew him well, because Marcus had spent the better part of his adult life ensuring his own emotional spaces remained carefully controlled and largely uninhabited. His story begins on a rainy Thursday evening when he received a text message that would challenge everything he believed about his own emotional evolution. The message came from Sarah, someone he had dated 2 years earlier. They had shared 3 months of what Marcus now preferred to call a pleasant companionship rather than a relationship. Sarah was writing to tell him she was getting married, and in a moment of reflection, she wanted to thank him for teaching her what she actually wanted in a partner. She wrote that their time together had shown her the difference between being with someone who was physically present and being with someone who was emotionally available. Marcus read the message twice, set his phone down, and felt something twist in his chest. But here's where his mind performed its familiar magic trick. Instead of sitting with the uncomfortable realization that he might have missed out on something meaningful, Marcus immediately began reframing the entire situation. Within minutes, he had transformed Sarah's gentle observation into evidence of his own superior emotional intelligence. She simply wasn't sophisticated enough to appreciate a relationship without drama, he told himself. The fact that she wanted more emotional intimacy became proof that she was needy and immature. Her desire for deeper connection transformed in his mind into evidence that she lacked the independence and self-sufficiency that truly evolved people possessed. Marcus felt a familiar sense of relief wash over him as his mental reframing machine worked its magic, turning potential pain into a comfortable sense of superiority. But the story doesn't end there, because life has a way of testing our most carefully constructed defense mechanisms. 3 weeks later, Marcus attended a gallery opening where he encountered Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You. Well, not literally Joe Goldberg, but someone who reminded him of that character's intense, obsessive approach to connection. This person, David, had been pursuing a mutual friend with an almost suffocating level of attention and declared devotion. Watching David's desperate attempts to prove his love, Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. This is exactly why emotional detachment is superior, he thought. Look at how pathetic neediness makes people become. But then something unexpected happened. Their mutual friend, instead of being repulsed by David's intensity, seemed genuinely moved by his willingness to be vulnerable and open about his feelings. Marcus watched in confusion as she responded warmly to exactly the kind of emotional expression he had learned to view as weakness. The evening took another turn when Marcus overheard their friend telling someone else, "It's so refreshing to meet someone who isn't afraid to show they care. Most people are so emotionally unavailable these days." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but his reframing mechanism immediately kicked into high gear. "She'll learn," he told himself. "Give it a few months and she'll realize that emotional independence is much more valuable than this juvenile intensity." Yet something had shifted. For the first time in years, Marcus began to notice the automatic nature of his mental reframing process. He started catching himself in the act of transforming every instance of emotional need or vulnerability he witnessed into evidence of other people's inferiority. The awareness was uncomfortable, like suddenly noticing your own breathing and not being able to stop thinking about it. The climax of Marcus's story came 6 months later when he found himself in the hospital after a minor accident. As he lay in the recovery room, he realized something that shook him to his core. He had no one to call. Not because he lacked acquaintances or colleagues, but because he had systematically reframed every relationship that might have involved genuine emotional support as somehow beneath him. His superiority had protected him from pain, but it had also isolated him from comfort, care, and connection. But here's the most important part of Marcus's story, and what makes it relevant to understanding how avoidants reframe pain into superiority. Even this moment of clarity became another opportunity for his mind to perform its protective magic. Instead of feeling sad about his isolation, Marcus began to frame it as evidence of his remarkable self-sufficiency. "Look how well you handle challenges alone," his mind whispered. "You don't need anyone else because you're stronger and more capable than people who require emotional support." So how does this mental reframing actually work? And what can someone do if they recognize this pattern in themselves or others? The first thing to understand is that this isn't a character flaw or a sign of emotional weakness. The avoidant mind's ability to transform pain into superiority is actually a sophisticated defense mechanism that likely developed for very good reasons. Perhaps emotional needs weren't met consistently in early life, or maybe vulnerability was met with rejection or dismissal. The mind learned to protect itself by reframing emotional needs as unnecessary luxuries rather than fundamental human requirements. Think of it like developing a mental immune system against emotional pain. Just as your body learns to recognize and neutralize physical threats, the avoidant mind learns to recognize emotional threats and neutralize them by transforming them into evidence of strength. When someone with this pattern experiences rejection, instead of feeling the sting of being unwanted, their mind quickly reframes the other person as not worthy of their time anyway. When they feel lonely, instead of acknowledging the need for connection, they transform that loneliness into proof of their admirable independence. This process involves several cognitive biases that work together like a well-orchestrated team. The confirmation bias plays a starring role, constantly searching for evidence that supports the belief that emotional independence is superior while ignoring evidence to the contrary. Remember Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris? She often displayed a tendency to interpret cultural differences and relationship challenges as proof that her American independence and self-reliance were superior approaches, rather than considering that different perspectives might offer valuable insights. The fundamental attribution error also makes a guest appearance in this mental show. When other people struggle with emotional needs or relationship challenges, the avoidant mind attributes this to their weak character or poor judgment. But when the avoidant person themselves experiences moments of longing or emotional need, those feelings get attributed to temporary circumstances or external pressures rather than natural human needs. Now, if you recognize this pattern in yourself, the first step isn't to judge yourself harshly or try to immediately change decades of mental conditioning. Instead, start by simply noticing when your mind performs this reframing magic trick. Catch yourself in the moments when pain or vulnerability gets transformed into superiority or judgment of others. This awareness alone can begin to create space between your automatic thoughts and your conscious choices. The next step involves what psychologists call cognitive diffusion, which sounds complicated, but actually means learning to observe your thoughts rather than immediately believing them. When you notice your mind saying something like "they're just too needy" or "people who require emotional support are weak," try adding the phrase "I'm having the thought that" to the beginning. So it becomes "I'm having the thought that they're too needy," or "I'm having the thought that people who require emotional support are weak." This simple addition creates psychological distance and reminds you that thoughts are mental events, not necessarily accurate reflections of reality. But here's where this gets particularly interesting, and why understanding this pattern matters so much for your relationships and overall life satisfaction. The avoidant reframing mechanism doesn't just affect how you interpret other people's behavior. It also shapes how you interpret your own experiences and emotions. When you automatically transform every emotional need into evidence of weakness, you cut yourself off from valuable information about what you actually want and need in life. Consider Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl, who often masked her deep need for genuine acceptance and love by projecting superiority and control. Her character arc throughout the series showed how this protective mechanism, while keeping her safe from some pain, also prevented her from experiencing the deep satisfaction that comes from authentic connection and vulnerability. The most compelling moments in her story came when she allowed herself to drop the superiority mask and acknowledge her real feelings and needs. The third step in working with this pattern involves what therapists call emotional validation, which means learning to treat your emotions as important sources of information rather than problems to be solved or weaknesses to be overcome. This doesn't mean acting on every emotion or letting feelings control your decisions. Instead, it means acknowledging that emotions, even uncomfortable ones like loneliness, sadness, or fear, provide valuable data about your inner experience and your needs. When you feel lonely, instead of immediately reframing it as evidence that you're more independent than people who need social connection, try asking yourself what that loneliness might be telling you. Maybe it's information that you value connection more than you've been willing to admit. Maybe it's data suggesting that your current lifestyle isn't fully aligned with your deeper needs and values. The loneliness doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The fourth step involves gradually experimenting with small acts of emotional risk-taking and vulnerability. This doesn't mean diving into the deep end of emotional expression overnight. Instead, it means taking tiny steps toward acknowledging your emotional needs and allowing others to see glimpses of your authentic experience. Maybe it means admitting to a friend that you sometimes feel lonely, or sharing with a colleague that you actually do care about their opinion of your work. Here's what makes this particularly challenging for people with avoidant patterns. Vulnerability often feels dangerous because it goes against years of conditioning that equates emotional needs with weakness. Your mind might immediately try to reframe these small acts of openness as mistakes or signs that you're becoming too dependent on others. Expect this resistance, and remember that it's your protective mechanism doing its job, not evidence that vulnerability is actually dangerous. But there's something else crucial to understand about this reframing pattern, something that might surprise you. The superiority that comes from reframing pain isn't actually satisfying in the long term. It provides temporary relief and a sense of control, but it doesn't create the deep satisfaction that comes from genuine connection and authentic living. Think about it. When you transform every emotional need into evidence of your superiority, you're essentially telling yourself that a fundamental part of being human is beneath you. The fifth step involves learning to distinguish between healthy independence and defensive superiority. Healthy independence means being capable of taking care of yourself while also remaining open to connection and support from others. It means having a strong sense of self while also recognizing that humans are inherently social beings who thrive on connection. Defensive superiority, on the other hand, involves cutting yourself off from connection to avoid the risk of pain or disappointment. Love Quinn from the Netflix series You demonstrates an extreme version of how the need for connection can become distorted when it's not acknowledged and processed in healthy ways. While her character took things to dangerous extremes, her underlying struggle with acknowledging emotional needs while maintaining a sense of control reflects patterns that many people experience in less dramatic ways. The key is finding ways to honor both your need for autonomy and your need for connection without sacrificing either. Now, if you're recognizing this pattern in someone you care about rather than in yourself, understanding their reframing mechanism can help you respond more effectively to their behavior. When someone consistently transforms their pain into superiority, arguing with their conclusions or pointing out their defensive patterns usually backfires. Instead, you can learn to see through their protective mechanism to the underlying humanity and vulnerability that they're working so hard to protect. The sixth and perhaps most important step involves developing what psychologists call emotional granularity, which means learning to identify and name the full spectrum of your emotional experience. People with avoidant patterns often have a limited emotional vocabulary, categorizing most uncomfortable feelings as either fine or annoyed. Learning to distinguish between loneliness and sadness, between disappointment and anger, between fear and anxiety, gives you much more precise information about your inner experience and what you might need. This emotional granularity also helps you communicate more effectively with others. Instead of expressing frustration through superiority or withdrawal, you can learn to identify and express what you're actually feeling and needing. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally reactive or dramatic. It means becoming more precise and honest about your inner experience, which paradoxically often leads to better emotional regulation and more satisfying relationships. The truth is, learning to work with avoidant reframing patterns isn't about becoming more emotionally dependent or losing your sense of independence. It's about developing a more accurate and complete picture of yourself and your relationships. It's about learning to see emotional needs as information rather than weakness, and connection as a strength rather than a liability. So here we arrive at the heart of the matter, the place where understanding meets transformation. The avoidant tendency to reframe pain into superiority represents one of the most sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms humans have developed. It's a testament to the mind's incredible ability to protect us from experiences that once felt overwhelming or dangerous. But like any protective mechanism, it can outlive its usefulness and begin to limit rather than liberate us. Think about Marcus from our earlier story. His journey didn't end in the hospital room with that moment of recognition. Real transformation rarely happens in dramatic revelation scenes like the movies suggest. Instead, it unfolds slowly through hundreds of small moments where he chose to notice his reframing mechanism and experiment with different responses. Some days he succeeded in staying present with difficult emotions. Other days he fell back into familiar patterns of superiority and judgment. But gradually, something shifted. The shift wasn't that Marcus suddenly became comfortable with vulnerability or started seeking out emotional intensity. Instead, he began to develop what therapists call distress tolerance, the ability to stay present with uncomfortable emotions without immediately needing to transform them into something else. He learned that he could feel lonely without being weak, sad without being pathetic, or disappointed without being a victim. Remember Camille from Emily in Paris, who struggled with her own patterns of emotional protection and superiority in relationships. Her character arc showed how someone can maintain their strength and independence while also allowing themselves to acknowledge deeper needs and feelings. The most compelling aspects of her story emerged not when she was performing superiority, but when she was being genuinely herself, complete with contradictions and vulnerabilities. This is the paradox of emotional maturity. True strength includes the capacity to be vulnerable. Real independence includes the ability to depend on others when appropriate, and genuine superiority might actually lie in the willingness to be ordinary, flawed, and human. The person who never needs anyone isn't superior to the person who acknowledges their needs. They're simply more cut off from the full range of human experience. If you've recognized these patterns in yourself as we've explored this topic together, remember that awareness is always the first step toward choice. You don't have to change overnight, and you don't have to abandon all the protective mechanisms that have served you well. Instead, you can begin to develop more flexibility in how you respond to emotional challenges. You can learn to choose when independence serves you and when connection might offer something valuable. Start small. The next time you notice yourself feeling dismissive of someone else's emotional needs, pause and ask yourself what you might be protecting yourself from. When you catch your mind transforming your own discomfort into evidence of your superiority, experiment with staying curious about the original feeling for just a moment longer. These tiny moments of awareness and choice can gradually reshape deeply ingrained patterns. And if you recognize these patterns in someone you care about, remember that their superiority mask is protecting something tender and human underneath. Your patience, consistency, and refusal to take their defensive responses personally can create space for them to slowly experiment with different ways of being. You can't force someone to drop their protective mechanisms, but you can create an environment where it feels safer to do so. The goal isn't to become someone who needs constant emotional support or validation. The goal is to become someone who can access the full spectrum of human experience, including both independence and connection, strength and vulnerability, self-reliance and interdependence. This flexibility, this capacity to respond appropriately to different situations, rather than defaulting to the same protective pattern, represents true emotional maturity and freedom. So take what resonates from this exploration and leave what doesn't serve you. Begin where you are, with whatever capacity you have right now. Notice your patterns with compassion rather than judgment. And remember,
thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel. because you deserve beautiful relationships.